Good evening, and thank you so much for making time tonight to join us for a very special webinar featuring our very local Erika Bachiochi, and she will join us momentarily. First, I want to take this opportunity to welcome those of you who are new to our audience. We do have many new faces and names joining from around the country actually tonight to hear Erika speak. And we're so grateful that you are here. My name is Myrna Maloney Flynn. I'm the president of Massachusetts Citizens for Life, and it's a pleasure to get to know you. We hope that you will not only enjoy this event, but also our upcoming events that you can learn more about via email if you sign up for our email list, and also on our website or by following us on our social media platforms. A really quick plug for a couple of upcoming events that I think are very worthwhile. In April and May, we will have a series of pro-life messaging seminars that will be offered across the state at no cost. And this is going to be done in partnership with the Leadership Institute, which is a national organization, a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. And representatives from the Leadership Institute will be here with us to partner on these seminars that really are focused on helping all of us speak better about our advocacy when it comes to defending human life and really advocating for the dignity of women as well. These cost-free opportunities will be held in Berkshire County, Hampden County, Worcester County, and then in 3 different spots around Greater Boston and also on the Cape. So check back to our website in the coming days to learn more about those. And then also on May 2nd, we will be holding our annual Mother's Day dinner in Springfield, and we will be thrilled on that evening to welcome Stephen Mosier, who is the president of the Population Research Institute. Again, more about that opportunity, which is always a beloved tradition that we host at Mass Citizens for Life each year. And that is again, May 2nd in Springfield. And I think that's about it. It's time to get to Erika. Once again, Erika Bachiochi is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a legal scholar specializing in equal protection jurisprudence, feminist legal theory, Catholic social teaching, and sexual ethics. A 2018 visiting scholar at Harvard Law School, she is also a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute here in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where she founded and directs the Wollstonecraft Project. Erika's latest book is called The Rights of Women, Reclaiming a Lost Vision. And that was published by Notre Dame University Press in 2021. And the book was also named a finalist for the Intercollegiate Studies Institute's 2022 Conservative Book of the Year Award. And right after that book was published, and I had an opportunity to read it, it is outstanding. Massachusetts Citizens for Life decided to award Erika with our Ignatius O'Connor Award that fall at our banquet. And it was lovely to hear from Erika then. And it is a huge pleasure for me to honor her tonight, or for us rather to be honored by welcoming Erika tonight to speak to you. So Erika, with that, take it away.
Thanks so much, Myrna, for having me. It's really wonderful to be with you all. I'm sure I know many of you from Mass Citizens for Life events. So the first thing I'm going to do is share my screen, which of course, okay. All right, so it's great to be with you. It's Women's History Month, so I'm going to do some women's history, as my book is all women's history. So it's great to be here to talk to you about some of the themes from the book and sort of looking at the pro-life movement today. So it's said that the winners write the history, and I think this is very much true of women's history. So today, when most people think about the women's movement or feminism or even women's rights, it's generally a story that begins in their minds in the 1960s and 70s. Sure, there are debates within feminism, but they all emerged post-1960. If we think of a women's movement or the first wave of feminism before the 1960s, we tend to think of suffrage. Isn't that nice? In the first wave, we're told Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton won for us the vote. And if we know a bit more than that, rights to property and contract too. But according to the prevailing story, it's really only with the birth control pill and legal abortion that the women's rights movement got started in earnest. And there's a kind of lazy assumption that's shared increasingly on both the far left and the far right today. The latter strangely relies on the former's account of history. And the assumption is that an unbroken line can be drawn between the early women's rights advocates in the 18th and 19th century to the abortion-backed contraceptive revolution that would become the second wave of feminism. And so this nearly kind of hegemonic view we're offered today is that these two hallmarks of what we now call feminism, so women's rights, and on the one hand, sorry, I'm just going to move this so I can see my slides, see my picture, not my slides. So these two hallmarks of what most people think of as feminism, kind of women's rights on the one hand and the sexual revolution on the other, are all of a piece in this view. And they always kind of were. Indeed, these days, women's rights, when the word woman is even used, has become synonymous with or is entirely consumed by abortion rights. And so generally, if you're on the left of the political aisle, you're kind of in favor of this whole package deal. And if you're on the kind of far right, generally, you're opposed. The trouble is that this account of history and of women's rights is flat wrong. Firstly, for the simple reason that, as we heard in that lovely video, the earliest women's rights advocates in our country were staunchly opposed to abortion, which most people now know thanks to the great work of Feminists for Life in particular. For them, for these women, it would have been philosophically untenable to claim that women had the right to end the life of their unborn children because, as I'll demonstrate today, they fought for their rights in order to carry out the duties they had to their children and beyond. And so, and this is where I'm going to get a bit technical, but I really wanted to share this from a recent presentation I gave to the Catholic Bar Association. I'm not going to get nearly as deep as I did with them. But I just want to talk about the kind of two rival accounts. It's kind of more accurate to say, rather than this simplistic framework that I've set up, that there are two basic rival accounts of women's rights that exist in American history. And these disparate accounts of women's rights map onto rival accounts of rights per se, which themselves map onto rival of accounts of who we are as human beings. So to my mind, these rival accounts of the human person and the theories of law and rights that flow from them explain much of our legal and political discord today. And this is why discord around feminism is at the heart of our cultural and political battles these days. So I'm happy to point you to this essay that is from that Catholic Bar Association presentation. And actually, if you just click on the very top here where it says two rival accounts, you can read that essay entirely if you wish. But for our purposes tonight, I just want to name these two accounts. I'm not going to get into sort of the philosophical backdrops of them or anything like that. I want to offer a quick description and then move on to how these rival accounts manifest in the history of women's rights in particular. So first, the natural law account, which is on the right of your screen, in which human beings are interdependent and rights and duties are correlative. I'm going to see that as I'll say, in the 18th and 19th century in general, women's rights accounts. And then the second, which I have on the left of my screen, the autonomy account, in which rights are protectors or powers that both protect me from another's harm, but also allow me to do what I want, as so long as I don't harm another. That account is very much prevalent in sort of the really regnant account of how pretty much, legal rights, legal scholars think about rights today. So though the history is more complicated than this, because there are definitely internal tensions, on the whole, we can say that the early women's rights advocates of the 18th and 19th century adhered to a natural law account of rights, there on the right, while the second wave, or the 1970s feminism, adhered to the autonomy account on the left. And so this latter autonomy account ultimately became synonymous with women's rights and feminism itself. And so that's why we have women's rights, abortion rights. Aren't they all the same thing? You can see this account on display in the very first page and throughout the dissent in the Dobbs opinion, of course, that case that overturned Roe v. Wade. So I'll just read the first quote there this is on the very first page of the opinion, respecting a woman as an autonomous being and granting her full equality means giving her substantial choice over this most personal and most consequential of all life's decisions. And I should note too, for any who are really interested in going deeper, that I have a law review article coming out in the Texas Review of Law and Politics next fall that really dives deeply into Dobbs, and especially the Dobbs dissent and the way in which they're relying on this account of rights that I think is really quite bad for women, as I'll get into, but I go through the case law there. So this autonomy property rights framing is also the one we've seen in most of the state battles over abortion in the last several months, where we've lost a lot. So the woman's bodily or decisional autonomy bests the very life of the vulnerable human being. Now, notice that baked into this view, there's sort of this subtle, we would say a priori in law determination, that the pregnant woman lacks responsibility to the human being growing inside of her, or rather, there's no inquiry into responsibility at all. But as I'll argue tonight, the early women's rights advocates conceived of their rights entirely differently. It's very clear that they, much like the American founders, viewed rights and duties as correlative. And so as they agitated for their civil and political rights in order to carry out their duties to their children and beyond. Okay, so with these basic concepts on the table, let me now back up and notice something curious and something really important about the history of women's rights at their origins. What we now call the first wave of feminism arose at a particular time in the history of the world, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, with the rise of liberalism and capitalism and the Industrial Revolution they both inspired. We often think of feminism as an aspect of liberalism, as kind of asserting the rights of women alongside the rights of men. And there's no question that the liberal philosophies of the Enlightenment played an instigating role. But if we read the women of the first wave really closely, and not only the more radical women who feminist historians tell us had all the influence, but the actual women who wielded particular influence, especially across long swaths, wide swaths of women at that time, we begin to see that the first wave was also a reaction against liberalism and the way in which the new market economy was threatening the culture shaping, caregiving life of the home and the men, women, and children within it. Now, remember, for most of human history, mere survival and subsistence living required a profound collaboration between men and women and their children in the agrarian home. Mothers worked with their young children alongside, underfoot, or when small enough, strapped to their chests or backs. Whether growing or preparing food, sewing or mending clothing, or shepherding the fruit of their labors to barter or sale, women's traditional work in the agrarian era was both economically essential to the family's subsistence and carried out while tending to their children. Most men also worked at or close to home, even as men's superior physical strength and women's capacity for childbearing and nursing fit each for distinctive labors in the agrarian homestead. In some sense, nearly all work then in a pre-industrial agrarian age might be considered domestic work, part and parcel of the sustenance and management of the existentially interdependent and productive household. As historian Alice Clark writes of the pre-modern economy, quote, women hardly could have been regarded as the mere dependents of their husbands when the clothes for the whole family was spun by their hands. But the rise of industrial capitalism transformed the work of the home, drawing remunerative work or paid labor out of the household. This made married women far more economically dependent upon their wage-earning husbands than they had been during the long history of household and spousal interdependence. And all this, in turn, made women far more vulnerable when their husbands gave way to temptations in the new city's bars and brothels and to male abandonment and bad behavior generally. And we have to remember the kind of alienation that many of the men were experiencing themselves in terms of the very harsh industrial workplace, but also being kind of stripped of their agency within their home and working for themselves and now working for someone else at low wages, etc. And then poorer women who's either, poor women who just, both spouses need to work, or those whose children's fathers had abandoned them were themselves foisted into the harsh industrial workplace as well, often leaving children, we can read and see in movies and all of that to fend for themselves. That is to say that industrialization brought the sometimes harsh realities of sexual asymmetry or the unequal vulnerabilities that accompany sex and childbearing for women to the fore in an altogether new and urgent way. And so it is here that we see the emergence of what would eventually be called the first wave of feminism, a movement dedicated to ensuring that women's distinctive needs and interests and those of their children were met in an industrializing society that seemed increasingly hostile to them. So, in response to the monumental political and economic transitions of the modern era, the early women's rights movement sought marital and contract rights, as well as joint property ownership, to justly recognize their economic contributions in the home and outside of it, and protect them as well in the case of marital abandonment and breakdown. They argued internally, really interestingly, this is one of the favorite parts of my book, in negotiations over protective labor legislation for women workers. And they eventually did win suffrage. But it was really the Women's Christian Temperance Union president, Frances Willard, who is most responsible for pushing through the 19th Amendment, because she was able to persuade her hundreds of thousands of members across the country, Christian members, Christian women, that it was that suffrage, the ballot was needed as the home protection ballot. It was very tied to temperance. These women wished to be treated in law as the full moral agents they were, capable and responsible for themselves and their lives and their families. They argued very explicitly then for rights to carry out their duties as consistent with the natural law. We see this in the very first convention for women's rights at Seneca Falls in 1848. The equality of civil and political rights is grounded in the very nature of men and women as rational creatures with common capacities and responsibilities. There, that in the bold resolved, the equality of human rights results necessarily from the fact of the identity of the race and capabilities and responsibilities. Or as another women's rights convention put it, women are human beings whose rights correspond with their duties. They are endowed with conscience, reason, affection, energy, for the use of which they are individually responsible. And then my very favorite, Lucy Stone, very prominent women's rights advocates. We are all getting to be women's rights advocates, or rather, investigators of women's duties. And so this view of rights and responsibilities as correlative makes sense then of another key demand of the early women's rights movement that is much less appreciated in our history books. The first wave also agitated strongly in favor of a single moral standard when it came to sex. So often against the so-called marital right by which husbands, or wives, I suppose, but husbands generally, were legally authorized to take their wives sexually whenever they pleased, the 19th century women's rights advocates called for what they called voluntary motherhood, or the right to engage voluntarily in that act that might make one a mother. This is because they knew that women were mothers with all the responsibilities of motherhood, not just when their children were born, but from the time they begin developing in their mother's wombs. Simply put, mothers properly owed their children duties of care, so women should have a say in when they become a mother. As one of the most radical women's rights advocates, Victoria Woodhull, put it, and you quoted her before, and here's a bunch of different quotes of hers, women were, when they were pregnant, were directly charged with the care of embryonic life. And the rights of children begin while yet they remain the fetus. There's another, that big long quote there is one of the best kind of, and still one of the best kinds of pro-life arguments I think we have. Or as OBGYN Alice Stockholm wrote in her book, Toxology, sorry, I'm going to skip now if you're reading, by what false reasoning does she convince herself that another life, still more dependent upon her for its existence, with equal rights and possibilities, has no claim upon her for protection. And this book, Toxology, it was translated in many languages. It was published, great numbers were published, and it was intended to really be an education on fetal development, but also women's health generally. An excellent new book just out this year, Pity for Evil, offers really the most granular detail of any book to date of our country's earliest female doctors and their views of abortion. These women knew the science of embryology, and they wanted to ensure that ordinary women understood their reproductive and biological realities too. So Dr. Stockham, Dr. Anna Dunsmore, and other female doctors and women's rights advocates offered public talks to educate women about these matters. Women's rights newspapers like Anthony and Stanton's Revolution reported on these talks. So for instance, Dr. Dunsmore explained that, quote, few women, even among the educated and intelligent, realize that the embryo is imbued with the life element prior to the moment when its physical movements become conscious to her. She said that the matter was one least understood, but one necessary to comprehend in order that the duties and responsibilities of maternity and child culture should be realized. In fact, when Dr. Dunsmore explained the details of embryology to the women at the public talks, Dunsmore reported that women fainted for only at that moment realizing what they had done in aborting their pregnancy. They had abdicated the duties of care to their own children, and violently. I just want to note that everyone should go out and get this book. It is incredible. It's primary research, especially in the papers of the Revolution, but the really incredible work, especially give it to your friends who are pro-life doctors. I think it will be very encouraging to them. So I will soon discuss the departure of all this from second wave pro-choice feminism, but I should note here that I find it particularly ironic that many pro-choice feminist legal scholars insist that our law today retains something like the common law's treatment of quickening as a significant demarcation of the legal status of the unborn child. But such an approach rested upon a scientifically rudimentary understanding of fetal development, one that had to rely upon women's subjective feeling to detect and track the progression of pregnancy. And so our country's earliest female doctors worked in these lectures they gave and in books they wrote and things that they published and in opening hospitals for women and all of that. They worked to correct this outdated medical understanding as embryology became more and more clear to the medical community, even as the 19th century women's rights advocates worked to correct outdated misconceptions of women's inferiority to men. Now, notably, the 19th century women's rights advocates did not look enthusiastically to the various primitive contraceptive methods to prevent pregnancy. They sought chastity instead. So speaking for the movement as a whole, Sarah Norton, who worked successfully for the admission of women into Cornell University, said she cast blame directly on the sexual double standard. Is there no remedy for all this antenatal child murder? Perhaps there will come a time when the unchastity in men will be placed on an equality with the unchastity of women, and when the right of the unborn will not be denied or interfered with. Similarly, one of the resolutions at Seneca Falls read, the same amount of virtue, delicacy, and refinement of behavior that is required of women in the social state should also be required of man, and the same transgression should be visited with equal severity on both man and woman. So the single moral standard they demanded was not the low standard of mere consent or safe sex as we have today. Rather, these women demanded a high standard of care, mutuality, and respect between spouses in marriage. In the words of Sarah Grimke, a very influential author of essays on both the equality of the sexes and marriage, among others, she said, our greatest desire is to purify and exalt the marriage relation and destroy all licentiousness. And marriage, she says, is the origin of life. This is part of her full vision of voluntary motherhood, and she may actually have been the first to coin the term early in the 19th century. So it's not just the right to say no to sex when you're not prepared to be a mother, But as Grimke envisioned early on, a willing recognition of each other's rights and mutual wants, a joyful appreciation of the blessedness of parentage, the birth of health, comely children, and a beautiful home. And then here is Dr. Stockham again articulating the need for men to share in the responsibilities of sexuality. When girls are given proper instruction upon the relation of the sexes and understand how to guard and govern themselves, when young men are taught that virtue has as high a meaning for one sex as another, because remember, virtue at that time was often just seen as completely synonymous with female chastity, that the protective chivalry of which they boast does not imply that they shall force the woman to the defensive, and that the paternal interest in and responsibilities for a child are equal to the maternal, that the temptation to produce abortion will not exist. And the data tells us that this is still true. When men take up their responsibilities as fathers, women are far less likely to obtain abortions. In a word, the country's earliest women's rights advocates, and our first female doctors too, spoke very clearly about the moral evil of abortion, even as they pitied those women who, out of either ignorance or desperation, fought ways to procure one. So what happened to this noble vision? Well, as the women's rights advocates of the late 19th and early 20th centuries were responding to these kind of deracinating impact of liberalism and industrialization, and the ways in which this was shaking up and disrupting sort of the goods of the home. And they responded with calls for their civil and political rights, just treatment in the workplace, and chastity on the part of men and women. Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger emerged with an altogether new solution to the asymmetries of human reproduction: technology. So she's writing, of course, in the early 20th century. In her view, just labor laws, workplace protections for working women, marital rights in terms of voluntary motherhood, that type of thing, these were mere palliatives, she said, or band-aids. Society had to get to the root of woman's immiseration, the fertile female body. Now, I want to just emphasize with one more long quote that the difference between Sanger and the early women's rights advocates couldn't be greater. So here is the co-author of the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions at Seneca Falls, who we really don't hear as much about, Lucretia Mott. She was a Quaker and a very religious woman who looked to, just as Sarah Grimke did, looked to the Bible, to Genesis and the Imago Dei, to really ground her understanding of women's rights. She actually had a dispute with Stanton later, and many of them were upset with Stanton later, who tried to rewrite the Bible as a woman's Bible. And she said, "What are you doing? You're sort of giving in to those who claim that the Bible itself does not ground, our equal dignity. Why would you do that?" And so she's really looking to the Bible to ground dignity, Lucretia Mott. She says, "Let women cultivate all the graces and proper accomplishments of her sex, but let not these degenerate into a kind of effeminacy in which she is satisfied to be the mere plaything or toy of society, contented with her outward adornings, and with the tone of flattery and fulsome adulation too often addressed to her. True, nature has made a difference in her configuration, her physical strength, her voice, and we ask no change. We are satisfied with nature. But how has neglect and mismanagement increased this difference? It is our duty to develop these natural powers by suitable exercise, so they may be strengthened by use, by reason of use." So while the early women's rights advocates took pride in their womanhood and capacity for maternity, Stanton herself said that motherhood made women second to God. Sanger wished to free women altogether from the consequences of asymmetry. Sanger's wildly successful campaign from birth control, offered first as a prophylactic against abortion, radically reoriented our cultural response to sexual asymmetry. Again, these differences in, men and women both have sex, and women are the ones who bear children or can potentially bear children. No longer demanding sexual integrity and social supports for mothers, as the late 18th and 19th century women's rights advocates had, Sanger insisted upon each woman's social duty to technologically control her own fertility. Freed from the consequences of their fertility, women could be freed from the burdens of sex just like men. The just response, according to Sanger, to this reproductive asymmetry was no longer moral and social and even legal, it was technological. But Sanger's technological solution to reproductive asymmetry had unintended consequences that the early women's rights advocates had intuited. Unmooring sex from its reproductive potential dramatically increased sexual risk taking, both within but even more so outside of marriage. With this increase in non-marital sexual activity came a spike in single motherhood and a growing demand for abortion too, whose legality, of course, eventually followed. And all of these unintended consequences impacted women far more than men. Thus began the running together of what was the sexual revolution with the pill and abortion with 1970s feminism, the movement my friend Mary Harrington has provocatively called bio-libertarianism. So not feminism, which is looking to the interests of women, but bio-libertarianism, liberating us from our bodies under kind of the guise of a second wave of feminism. She also has a pithy statement that it's not that feminism did not begin but end with the sexual revolution. Indeed, for the last half century, constitutionally protected access to abortion gave men and women a presumed right to non-procreative sex, and with it, the putative right to sexual pleasure. After Roe v. Wade, sex was an act by which one fundamentally expressed, defined, and enjoyed oneself, rather than also the way new human beings enter the world. With birth control and abortion available to them, women then now seem to be as autonomous as men. With equal autonomy, now the goal, and this is, explicitly what pro-choice, especially legal scholars, including someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, argued for, abortion then becomes the sine qua non. So the revolution born of these techno or pharmacological interventions like the pill and abortion, thus has been accompanied, I think, and I think we see this all around us, by a culture-wide cognitive dissonance. And this is particularly true for young women today. I engage casually in sex, I'm not even sure I want, as a kind of right, a right that for women too often becomes a kind of duty, and then am struck pregnant against my will. It is the government then, in seeking to restrict abortion, that would force me to be a mother. When men engage in their supposed right to sex, they can just enjoy the sex and walk away after all. And so equality demands that women ought to enjoy a right to end the life of their nascent children. And again, a lot of my work in constitutional law has been, and really, as I say in one of my law review articles, debunking these equality claims or equal protection claims, which is really the way that, the women's rights advocates today, I don't even want to call them women's rights advocates, pro-choice feminists today have sought to ground the abortion right as in equality, equal protection, or through the due process clause, kind of, equality as equal autonomy. So the chief trouble, in my view, with this feminist view, and feminist is very much in quotes, is not only that it locates women's equality in a kind of imitation of irresponsible male abandonment, as though women through abortion are now able, like men, to just walk away, and that's supposed to be a good thing, I guess, nor that it accepts as just the violence and domination of the stronger mother over the weaker. Obviously, this is a horror, but I think that we need to get to a deeper problem with a feminism that depends on abortion rights, as serious as these other injustices are. Such a view, when it takes hold of a culture, eats away, slowly perhaps, but surely, at that culture's capacity to recognize and so authentically respond to these asymmetries that are at the very heart of the sexual relationship between men and women, though they remain there all the same. The technological response to sexual and reproductive asymmetry have worked to paper over asymmetries. And so they've erased from our cultural mind's eye that which differentiates women from men. And so, of course, the trans confusion comes flying in ineluctably. But women are designed unlike men, to nurture vulnerable human beings inside our very bodies, even if we never do. This capacity is not determinative of being a woman, no doubt at all, but by obscuring it, even or especially as a means to equality, always ends poorly for women and their children too. And I don't need to even detail this for you because I'm sure many examples are coming to mind. It's happening in front of us, our noses every day. So how did these 19th century pro-life feminists help us today with the mess we're in? I shouldn't laugh. It's quite awful and horrible. So first, I want to suggest a small, but I think really significant shift in how we talk about the issue of abortion that really harkens back to the first wave. So right now, I think we're losing in part. Now we're losing significantly because of the way in which for 50 years we've been arguing about the Constitution and law and all those kinds of things, and not as much about the moral case. But we're also losing in part, and I mean, we could list all sorts of reasons why we're losing because of just the kind of moral temperature, the moral decline of our culture. There's no question about that. But I think we're also playing on the rhetorical battlefield of the autonomy framework when we talk about the rights to the unborn against the rights of the woman. And it's really at odds with the truth, the natural law truths that we wish to communicate. So when a woman's rights to bodily autonomy or, quote, reproductive freedom is put up and against the right to the 6-week-old embryo or the 3-month-old fetus, the woman's right to reproductive freedom wins and wins and keeps winning, except in the reddest of states. And this is because of this kind of autonomy framework, because this nascent child, this small, small child, is anything but autonomous, right? Doesn't have that kind of independence that's needed to have rights in this autonomy view. So as I hope I've demonstrated, for the 19th century feminists, like the American founders, rights were not viewed as protections for autonomy. They were inextricably linked or correlated with our responsibilities, with our interweaving and interdependent duties, others. But today, even as it grieves me greatly to acknowledge it, the language of rights is no longer obviously correlative with duties, with responsibilities. Rather, rights today are just this shorthand for autonomy, for the unlimited freedom to do as I please, especially with my own body. And so the whole rights-ridden debate is taking place on an intellectual foundation that is inhospitable to the truth of what it is to be human. In fact, we pro-lifers know that to be human is to be a lot like the embryo, dependent and vulnerable, and in need of many others if we are to flourish, to mature enough to carry out our own duties of nurture and care that are interdependent and lifelong and unexpected often. So we need a new language to move our interlocutors from the autonomy framework into the natural law framework, but we of course can't use the language of natural law because people go screaming the other direction. And so if we think about it, I mean, the abortion debate is most fundamentally a debate about justice, right? What we owe the unborn child simply by virtue of that child being human, being part of the human family. So in my view, I think it's really helpful. And believe me, I try this. I do this all the time, both on the Ezra Klein show in an interview and also in a classroom at BU Law that I was invited to talk to a class that was on reproductive rights and justice. So sure, everyone in the class was very, very pro-choice. And I think what I try to do is just discipline myself to employ the language of justice, not necessarily the word justice, but by talking about what we owe one another, this language of what we owe. And rights actually once did this. We used to talk about rights, and right away it would conjure up what we owe. But that's not the case anymore. So I think if you push people, and again, I do this a lot, left, right, and center, and we have to do it on the right as well. So to think in terms of what we owe. And they do tend to acknowledge that we human beings owe duties of care to one another. Not everyone, but a vast swath of the public, in my view, in my experience, acknowledges this. They acknowledge that we human beings owe duties of care to one another, to the weaker, to the dependent, to the vulnerable, especially our own children, those who we have special responsibilities to. If you ask them about the kind of people they think we ought to be, that they personally want to be, they still tend to value those who faithfully carry out their obligations, their duties, their responsibilities to vulnerable others, or those, who are knit together in the family, especially. The mistrust of institutions in our day, I think, is due in large part to too many in authority abdicating their sacred duties. In fact, we might even be able to agree that across much of the political spectrum, the most basic purpose of our political community is to provide the stable, just, and peaceable conditions for persons in their families and workplaces to carry out their responsibilities to each other. So remember how the early women's rights advocates and the doctors foregrounded justice, the duties of care mothers owed their children, and how that allowed them, and it can allow us, to move quite logically then to the justice fathers owe mothers and children. In this way, we can then argue that lifelong monogamous marriage is the just response to these sexual and reproductive asymmetries or inequalities that I've been talking about, as the strong correlation between fatherlessness and poverty shows. Engaged fatherhood, fathers being there, fathers taking responsibility, is an issue of both familial and social justice. So foregrounding these intersecting duties of care from mother to child, from father to mother and child, can also help us think about the duties we as a community owe to the family, and the family owes the community. And I think the 19th century women's movement really got this. So what did they do? Well, they focused their efforts on those educational, cultural, and legal means that would so improve women's lives that they would not feel the need to seek out abortions. Because again, at that point, they were basically illegal in their time, but there were still ways to try to find illegal abortions as there are today, or people can cross state lines, etc. So it's really, the idea is you have to get women and men on the side of the life of their unborn child. Law is, good and important because it's educative and all that, but it's not going to do the whole task of really preventing abortion the way we need to. In addition, and the women's rights advocates knew that too. In addition to advocating for equal rights in marriage, including voluntary motherhood, to property, contract, education, the professions, and the franchise, these women worked for improvements in maternal and fetal health. They founded female staffed hospitals for women. Again, the story in Pity for Evil about these women and their hospitals, these female doctors, is really just amazing, so inspiring. And they raised funds for the creation of maternity homes in which vulnerable mothers, abandoned, impoverished, or fleeing abuse, would be supported to nurture and raise their children with confidence. The story and the authors of Pity for Evil kind of dedicate their book to those pro-lifers who have been doing this, for the last 50, 60, 70 years and beyond, but there's still much more work to be done. Today, the vast number of women who abort in the United States cite lack of financial resources as the motivating factor for their abortions. And the vast number of women who end their pregnancies are poor, very poor. In some segments of our population, it's not uncommon for a woman to need to return to work just days after having given birth. Much has changed since the 19th century, including some women who now shout their abortions. But many women still conceive children in very, very difficult circumstances today. It's no wonder then that many pro-life and pro-choice advocates can agree that generous social provisions for poor women and their families and humane workplace accommodations for childbearing and rearing would decrease the rate of abortion in our country, assisting women to access the resources they need to care for their children. Again, with the fathers of those children being the very first responsible for that. So the justice we need today would look to protect and promote the health and well-being of both unborn children and their mothers. It would also ensure that all women, especially the poor, have those financial resources, medical support, and workplace accommodations. But above all, I really think that we ought to reprioritize, in the words of Nobel Peace Prize recipient and Hull House founder Jane Addams, the family claim over the social claim. And if any of you know about Jane Addams, if you don't, again, another really inspiring woman, founded Hull House and took in a lot of these women in the 19th century during industrialization who had either been abandoned or had to go and work because they had, they were poor in the industrial workplace, and the kids would, be there at Hull House taken care of. And they really created just a culture. I mean, I would just love to see new Hull Houses with founders like Jane Addams, really putting this family claim over the social claim. So how might we do that? So I don't think it's in seeking to return, as some kind of traditionalists are arguing today, to the strict 1950s settlement of public men and private women, even if some families would and happily do arrange themselves that way. Indeed, in our post-industrial, technologically advanced economy, in which women are as educated as men and younger fathers, much like their agrarian predecessors, are increasingly invested in the care, nurture, and education of their children. Determining who does what when with their particular gifts and constraints requires a practical wisdom that mothers and fathers must together employ for the good of their family. But encouraging that wisdom requires law and policies that respect the work of the family as foundational to every social, political, and economic good, and thus respect the responsible agency of each family to best organize itself according to its own concrete needs. Although culture is always the best mover of social norms, the state, the workplace, schools, and other institutions play key family supportive roles too. After all, incentives exist throughout society that tend to influence the decisions women and men make and are free to make in the tax code, in the job market, and corporate policies, and public accommodations, and educational offerings, and housing and healthcare costs, in childcare regulations, and of course, in laws governing marriage and the duties of care in the family. Some cultural influences and economic realities forestall family formation altogether, create this situation where a woman feels driven to abortion, or make family life far more difficult than it needs to be. Though we certainly cannot grant every family a smooth path, nor can we compel men and women themselves to prioritize the family claim over the social claim. Our institutions can remove some of the boulders along the way and spread the costs more fairly. While I would strongly recommend you read another book, Tim Carney's new book, just coming out actually on the Feast of St. Joseph, so very soon, his book, Family Unfriendly. It's tremendous, a really, really excellent book. And keep reading if you're bored by some of the early parts, but it's really, really good. And then generally, I would recommend following my colleague, my EPBC colleague, Patrick Brown's suggestions for family policy, but I'm happy to talk in the Q&A about any ideas as well. So to conclude, the early women's rights advocates recognize something that today's feminists seem blind to. When you belittle the moral status of the unborn child, you belittle each and every expectant mother. For the value of the work, the labor she is undertaking depends on the intrinsic value of the dependent human child in her care. The early women's rights advocates thereby sought not to transform women into irresponsible, autonomous men or unencumbered workers, but to transform social institutions to be more hospitable to women and children alike. As I argue in my book, it's time to reclaim their vision and finish their work. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much again, Erika, for joining us tonight. I know it's getting late. It's been a long day, but again, your insight into this issue and the approach that you're taking, I believe wholeheartedly will catch on in a greater way even that it already has, which is pretty significantly. So thank you again, and I wish you the best of luck in your work. Please keep working hard, doing what you're doing, because it is starting to turn the tide. I really believe that. So thank you.